When Lake brought up false claims about election fraud, the conversation turned to 2020. Here is that part of the interview.
So Kari Lake continues to push election misinformation, and this is putting the United States on an incredibly dangerous path.
My question is whether or not you would limit mail-in voting, limit early voting, given that so many people in the state, it's like 90%, vote early in this state or use early ballots.
We want to shore up our elections so they are very honest, and every voter knows that it's an honest system. Let me just give you a couple facts.
Yeah.
2,000 mail-in ballots were accepted by Maricopa County after Election Day in 2020, after Election Day.
That was a new one on us, so we took the claim to election officials in Maricopa County who told us it's just not true. In fact, no ballots were accepted after the Election Day 7 p.m. deadline. Some ballots were scanned the next morning, giving them a timestamp after Election Day, but again, those ballots were turned in on Election Day by the deadline.
So this interview with Kari Lake on ABC News highlights some of the absurd things that Kari Lake has been pushing that are fundamentally dangerous, because these Republicans have been doubling down on this election misinformation, specifically this idea that there's been some sort of massive election fraud, which I want to address really quick. Election fraud in the United States is incredibly rare, despite the fact that we do actually have a very undemocratic system. And you could even say that our system is rigged. But how is our system rigged? It's very clever. You see, what they do is they just deny people the right to vote. They gerrymander districts. They purge people from the voting rolls. And so a combination of felony voting laws, voter purges, gerrymandering, all of those things is how they stop people from voting with the intent of manipulating the results of the election. But when it comes to the actual counting of the ballots, it's very unlikely that there's any type of real voting fraud going on. But that's not what people like Kari Lake want you to believe. Now, why is that? It's not even that these Republicans necessarily believe this, because the reality is, I think the overwhelming majority of Republicans that push this misinformation actually don't believe it. They just want enough people to believe it to justify their denying of election results. Because obviously, as we saw with January 6th, there's a growing movement of right-wingers who fundamentally want to completely abandon the concept of democracy in and of itself, and are more than willing to completely overthrow any semblance of democracy that the United States has, with the express purpose of protecting the interests of wealthy business owners at the expense of everybody else. And that becomes very, very clear when you actually look at the types of people that were at January 6th. I mean, really, who can afford to take a week off of work to go storm the Capitol in Washington, D.C.? It turns out a lot of those people are like your local business owners. We're talking about restaurant owners, car dealership owner type of people who are deeply, deeply upset about the very brief moment in time when the United States government took seriously the issue of COVID and for a brief period of time prioritized people's needs over short-term economic gain. And even amidst that, they got huge handouts from the PPP loans and things like that. But fundamentally, there's an extreme reactionary base within the United States that feels like their economic power is threatened. And they are quite literally in a position now where they are raising skepticism about the idea of elections themselves, and in many places are even using violent force against people on the left and trying to normalize political violence, seemingly with the express aim of completely getting rid of any semblance of democracy for the purpose of supporting wealthy business owners at the expense of everybody else. This fundamentally is fascism at its core. So the reality is, it doesn't matter whether or not Kari Lake actually believes these ridiculous things. What matters is whether or not the Republican Party as a whole is willing to mobilize around this misinformation with the purpose of ushering in an extreme fascist regime within the United States of America. And the fact that Republicans in Congress have introduced a bill that would effectively ban trans people from public life is a pretty good sign that that is exactly what the Republicans want.